So let's kick things off. There was an article recently claiming that people were thieving if they were using ad blockers. And at the bottom of that article, as there often are online, were some comments from users. One of my favorites was, let's mention the criminality of the advertisers. 1, trespassing. Nobody invited you to post your junk on my computer. 2, theft. You've been stealing my bandwidth by forcing me to download your garbage. I have no problem paying for an ad blocker, any more than it would bother me to pay for poison to get rid of vermin in my house. So, are we fucked? Or to be nuanced about that, how fucked are we? Conor?
Okay, let's start easy then. I suppose we're as fucked as we've always been. I started my career working for Xerox, and in the first week I started there, I was told you're going to be out of a job because of the paperless office. Xerox evolved, it became the document company. It scans, it prints, it emails from the one document center now. So they've moved on. We will move on as well. This is part of a disruptive ecosystem. Ad blocking's been around for 10, 12 years, and it's another part in the Lumascape, it's another part in Scott Brinker's Martech, another little box that will produce more little boxes. So you've got SourcePoint, you've got PageFair to date, who are basically coming in and countering this. So it's part of the ecosystem. You need to deal with it. It's no different than, say, having a PVR on TV. So you've got a certain percentage of people who will always fast forward through the ads. You will similarly have this.
So more of the same, and it'll resolve itself somehow.
Yeah, I mean, look, I didn't see the actual results of the survey, and I'm not amiss of the irony that if there was ad blocking here, a third of the screen would be blacked out. But
that's native.
Yeah, sure. Let's go all native then. There's a lot of bad things that go on. There's problems with privacy, there's problems with bad ads, there's problems with literally this bandwidth thing I don't really get, because we've had people talking about video over mobile all morning. That sucks bandwidth. It's got nothing to do with the ads. It sucks bandwidth. The experience in terms of having a 30-second pre-roll versus a 10-second pre-roll, it's immaterial. Other than in terms of making the UX better. So I really think there are things we can improve upon.
Hello,
and
Roy.
This, allows us to innovate. You can't have innovation without disruption. This is another element of disruption.
Great, thank you. Before we move on to our next point there, Roy, thank you for joining us. Sorry you were trapped in traffic there, but would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure, hi. Apologies for being late, the rain. My name is Roi Carthy. I'm the CMO of Shine. We help carriers bring ad blocking to their subscribers.
Great. We started off talking a bit about the consumer view of why consumers are using ad blockers and where they're sort of justifying it from. It was an angry little comment from a Wall Street Journal article. So we were just talking a little bit about that, and that was really as far as we'd gotten. Do you want to comment a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it in quite those terms. From a privacy perspective, I think it comes down to the individual's choice about what happens on their device, what information gets sent. And firewalls, ad blockers are one part of that jigsaw. We've also seen from a security perspective, I think the Daily Mail, one of the ad companies that I think was the Daily Mail was using, was found to be injecting malware onto devices. So there is a cybersecurity perspective to this. From a privacy perspective, privacy and security are one and the same. And so while I wouldn't put it in those terms, I do think individuals do have that right to decide for themselves.
Got it. Roy?
So interesting you said malware and cybersecurity. So just to kind of take you back to the history of Shine, Shine was founded as an anti-malware company. The guys had this idea to reinvent the antivirus for mobile, create some algorithms, and in fact that's what they did. Lo and behold, when we started speaking to carriers about distribution, we were asked to look at a certain problem they were having, and we did, not being telco people. what we discovered was that what was really impacting the network, the infrastructure, right, which is less sexy, I understand that, but nonetheless impacting the infrastructure and impacting the consumers, the subscribers, was actually ad tech. And when we kind of looked at it with fresh eyes, we realized that you could easily redefine redefine malware to include ad tech. And the same methodologies, the same sophistication, complexities are quite similar to malware. In fact, the best minds of Silicon Valley are developing ad tech. So when you consider that, and then you realize that you would need a company of our sort, like Shine, who comes from cybersecurity, white hat hacking, that type of thing, to protect consumers, to be able to control ad tech, you can then start realizing how sophisticated and how problematic the whole situation is. This is a very serious game, and for the first time, you have consumers that have military-grade protection against ad tech. That's a first. That's what we do. There was nothing like that before Shine.
Military-grade protection from ad tech.
Indeed.
I
Wow.
thought the redefine ad tech as malware. I hadn't heard that one before.
And I'd kind of follow on from that in the sense that while we're in London in a cozy environment, that for some of the people we work with in Africa and South America, if their device betrays them, it's a matter of life and death. If a phone pings out to a server unencrypted and it gives away certain information, that can simply be the end for journalists. And we're seeing a lot of convergence between journalists and privacy advocates because they realize they need privacy of their sources, they need to keep their sources secure, and one of those things is making sure that malware is not on the device because it can betray their source and the journalist as well.
Yeah, thanks. So what we hear a lot of stats about the scope of the problem for publishers, the scope of the problem for advertisers. I thought it might be interesting just to take a look at a survey from consumers about why they're using ad blockers. So the top 5 reasons were: I feel blocking ads protects me from getting viruses. That was number 1 at 45%. Number 2, I feel blocking ads speeds up my computer. Fair point. It probably does. Point 3, I hate ads. Okay, so those people are going to be tough to win over no matter what we do. The ads distract me from what I'm doing, so people with ADD. And I feel that blocking ads gives me more privacy. So privacy
advertising works then.
Exactly.
That's right. So yeah, privacy is in the top 5. It's down near the bottom. What's interesting, though, is a few years back, the industry did get together, rather proactively, I thought, and tried to address some of the privacy concerns that were emerging at the time, and rolled out things like your online choices, the ability to opt out of third-party tracking. So that's been out there, but I'd be surprised if many people knew about that. And are people just ignoring that? Why do people feel that there's a privacy concern? Putting the malware bit to one side, which I think probably consumers are not super tooled up on right now. Are people not aware that they can opt out of tracking and that that ability is there? Right?
I think there's a very low level of awareness on that, to be honest. And look, I mean, it's a bit of a tragedy of the commons kind of situation where you've got good players and they're getting tarred by that same brush, right? By all the bad players out there that are engaging in whether it's malware, whether it's kind of violating the contract with the consumer, right? In terms of a fair exchange in terms of content for advertising, right? And so I think I think to Conor's earlier point, we'll get there. It's going to evolve, and we're going to find a happy medium. I mean, look, whether it was the DVR, PVR, like TiVo. I mean, back in the day, I remember the TV industry in the U.S. were going crazy because it wasn't TiVo. It was their competitor. They'd had this button where it would just let you skip 30 seconds ahead, right? And all hell was breaking loose, right? And where are we now? And same thing with piracy, by the way. Does anybody talk about piracy anymore, right? People have evolved, whether it's their products, their experiences, the technologies, right? And it's still an issue, right? It's still an issue. People still are on BitTorrent and all these things, but are people screaming headlines about it? No.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I think all these apocalyptic claims of this is the end of the internet is nonsense. I'm a little older than I look. I assure you, it's not going to be the end of the internet. I've seen the iterations. We're going to be fine. At the same time, though, if we look at DVRs and Netflix, these sorts of things, Netflix is mainstream now, right? 6 years later, we don't have 6 years for subscribers to continue to be abused. So we don't have the 6 years, or how many years it will take, probably take more, for the advertising industry to get its shit together, excuse my French, and say, okay, so we've screwed the pooch, as the IAB said last week, and now here's how we're going to fix it, and now we're going to make sure everybody abides, and in a bunch of years, it's going to be all groovy. We don't have that time. Right now, everybody here in this room, everybody's families in this room are being abused by ad tech.
I think, can I just cut in there? I think the use of abuse as a word is probably misleading. I mean, there's things that, just let me, no, it's not uncomfortable, because there are things that people are required to do. Every publisher is required to notify the user who comes onto their site that they use cookies. Yeah. And that user is allowed to go into that site, that beacon, and make choices. That person is allowed to do that. We introduced that as part of a European initiative. And people complained to us because we put it as a big fat banner at the top of the page that no one would miss. And the Data Protection Commissioner in Ireland came in and basically said, everybody has to follow that suit. They came into the UK and said, everybody has to follow that suit. And to say that it's abusing, I put it to you, Roy, you don't even have a data policy or a privacy policy on your own website. So, seriously, you can't start throwing words around saying abuse. It's just misleading.
No,
absolutely.
It's not
misleading.
Not at all. And I'll give you an example. So first of all, I assure you that most of the people that see the banner have no idea what a cookie is. They think it's an edible item.
Is that why you don't have a privacy policy on your site?
Why don't you guys have a privacy policy?
That's what disturbs you? But
no, it doesn't disturb me. But if you're getting on a high horse and talking about consumer abuse, at least stand up and put your money where your mouth is.
How do we abuse consumers?
Well, you've got no data policy, no privacy policy on your website.
We don't collect data.
You don't collect data at all.
Our customers, no.
You don't know who comes to your site.
Besides Google Analytics, no.
Okay, so you
IP
do collect.
That's your concern.
So you do collect data.
So let me understand.
So you do collect data.
So let me understand.
So you do collect data.
So let me understand. So that's your concern. Point noted. We'll make sure there's a privacy policy. You feel a little more comfortable. But let's be very clear.
I would suggest that you do that immediately if you're going to start getting on a point about consumer abuse.
Let's be very clear. Number one, we are the good guys. We protect consumers.
Well, then tell the consumer that you're the good guy because you're not saying it.
Check the news. We are, and it's been getting a lot of play. So that's the first item. Secondly, the cookie banner, which is absolutely disastrous, nobody understands what it means, has nothing to do with 1 second, a whole lot more abuse. So for example, when you click that OK about cookies, do you think the consumers, your families, have any idea what they're going to get in terms of advertising payload? Do you think that consumers should be subsidizing the advertising industry through their data plans? So that's why I feel abuse is a comfortable world.
Are you
if
now
not
saying
abuse,
then?
Are you okay with pollution?
So Conor, let me
answer
that. What I'd like to do is, because we are talking about sort of issues around privacy, and I'd love to hear from Richard, what your thoughts are on some of these topics around, who's paying for what, whose toes are being stepped on where.
Yeah, and so I understand, the cookie debate, obviously, but the cookie debate is really the tip of the iceberg when it comes to privacy implications of these systems, whether it's ad tech or other websites. And I think going back to the point that was made earlier, I'm not sure I know what the contract is between me and a publisher or between me and ad tech. And as you said, the logs of a collection of data in your server logs can be very revealing in terms of what time of day people are coming to your site. And so I think the cookie, addressing the cookies was one thing, the overt thing, but there are many other ways that the internet, just the way the internet is built, can betray us. And I think we need to do something about that collectively. Also, I'd make the point that some ad blockers, it is software that you're installing, and has the potential as well to be corrupted with malware. So there's a double edge to this, and for me it's more about the collection and empowering the user to not have to go and sign up to whatever the industry body is in order to opt out. That they should be able to actually control when my machine requests an ad. And that could be done in firewalls, various things like that. So the problem is bigger than cookies, and I think ad blockers are one part of the solution, but there is a bigger solution out there, I think.
Rags, what are your thoughts on some of this? Because I think there's a lot of sort of loaded language being thrown around, but I think, you zoom all the way back out, and the fact of the matter is the internet is ad-funded media.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's companies that have a clearly vested interest in being portrayed as the good guys and on the side of the consumer. And this kind of goes back to my previous presentation on there are bigger titans with agendas, right? Whether it's Google and Apple, whether it's telcos trying to kind of redo the dynamic between them and the dumb pipes that they are versus content owners and publishers, right, that are in their market. So they're looking for arms merchants to kind of arm them in this sort of war, if you will, right? But I think it's a lot more nuanced than that, right? I mean, there's, like I said, and I think that's my issue right now with the very broad brushes, right? So either you sort of pay the sort of the tax or the poll to get through, or everything gets blocked, right? There's no kind of, and it's a lot more nuanced. So if there should be programs and there should be transparency around them, right? In terms of what are the criteria to get blocked, right? Who kind of does get blocked and who doesn't? Who's paid, who hasn't? Those kinds of things, right? Because frankly, I mean, if a consumer goes to a site and this is interesting, right? It's where the ad blocker isn't the good guy, because actually you get content that's blocked, whether it's on Channel 4 or Axel Springer. And we've heard we've heard that from someone else. Consumers complaining to the ad block company saying, "Why are you blocking the content here? Your technology isn't working, right?" I wonder if that's for the consumer that having that experience.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. I think a nuanced approach is going to be very important. Now, Roy, help me understand. Help me sort of unpack a little bit about where you're coming from. So it sounds like you're specifically talking about ad blocking on mobile when users are on their 4G or carrier connection. What are your thoughts on desktop ad blocking, or when I'm using this over Wi-Fi? It seems like some of the argument sort of falls away at that point. So how do you break down sort of your view of ad blocking overall?
Sure. So put very simply, we believe the consumer has the right to block ads everywhere. Mobile, desktop, everywhere. And in fact, on desktop, it's very popular. And ironically, Google is the biggest distributor of ad blocking software in the world. Funny how that would work. And also, they're paying this quote-unquote extortion fee to IO. So the world works in funny ways. Now, our technology specifically is targeted more at mobile networks where there's where we feel there's a bigger opportunity and where they feel there's a bigger impact on subscribers' user experience. They believe it's called pollution. We remove that pollution. We're not philanthropists. We get paid for it. That being said, our technology works, has been tested, and is in discussions to come to fixed lines. So people dislike advertising. Not all of them, but a lot of them. We believe they should have the right to block ads. They should also have the right to switch it back on in case they'd like to see, the build, for example, or anybody else.
And I'd say
do consumers have the choice? Because your model is business to business, so the actual carrier is making the decision.
Then you would have to discuss it with the carrier, and there are many carriers around the world with different forms of legislation and different business interests.
So does the consumer have a say in it?
It's a question I can't answer because I don't speak on behalf of the carriers.
But you're speaking on behalf of the consumer.
I am speaking on behalf of the right of the consumer to block ads when he or she requests it.
Yeah, so that's the question I'm asking. Is the decision made at the carrier level, or is the decision made at the consumer level? Because ultimately we're talking about consumer choice. I can load as many ads on my site as I want, and the consumer can choose, I'm not coming back.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate ad blocking.
In most territories, the choice will be opt-in. In some territories, there is no need to opt in. You could opt out. For example, our first customer, which just announced itself a couple of weeks ago, the Digicel Group, will be deployed across 33 million subscribers by the end of 2016. It's all opt out. Okay, so they've turned off advertising, and by the way, call centers have gotten 0 calls on this.
So are we just having this discussion because we can do it? I'm sure, people always complain about ads. I watch TV through a Virgin Media box. I mean, that's through a carrier. Couldn't they just as easily say, oh, we're going to block all TV ads from you, and you can just stare at Teletubbies for 30 seconds?
If I believe in the more Western legislated world, that will be, of course, via opt-in. That's what the carriers are intending to do. And will they have that capability? Sure. You won't probably have it shoved down your throat. Again, it will be opt-in. But if you'd like to watch Teletubbies all day, that's your right, man.
So what I'm not understanding fundamentally, though, is that the internet is a ad-supported medium, and there is an unwritten contract between a consumer and a content provider that they are getting to consume that content which costs money to make in exchange for viewing and occasionally interacting with an ad. So why should the consumer have a choice about that? And if there's no other method for a publisher to collect that money? Rags.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as Conor said, there are different ways that choices manifest themselves, whether it's explicit through accepting cookies and knowing how your data are being used, to ones where you just literally you don't go to RTÉ anymore. You go to another site, right? I think where some of this comes down to is understanding how your data are being used, right? So as I explained earlier, some of the kind of the things around retargeting, right? And again, IO and this phenomenon started in Germany, which historically has had a very high degree of sensitivity to data protection and privacy and what have you, right? And so, I think clearly there's, we've all experienced sort of, that level of, hey, why am I getting this ad now, right? It's following me around, and so, consumers, I think, to that extent, yeah, they have a right to understand how the data are being used.
But unfortunately, even in the Data Protection Act, I think consumers only have a right to understand the class of businesses that their data can be transferred to, as opposed to the actual specific businesses themselves, and whether it's done via, say, Safe Harbor to the US or within the European Economic Area. And without that transparency, without that detailed understanding of where their information is going, and I'm not talking about the content of anything or various things like that. I'm actually talking about metadata like the IP address, how long you were on a site for, which isn't covered by the cookie directive, would seem to be a step in the right direction. But with consumers not having that information, I think people, as you saw, consume the worst. Or they can say, well, okay, maybe I'll buy an ad blocker and maybe stop some of this stuff. But at the end of the day, we're talking about different forms of content. Ads are content. It's just the individual should get the right to choose which content they want to see. Some of it will be ads. Some of it will be whatever articles they don't like. And it's more the advertising by default and surrendering your metadata to other companies when they're on a page that you go to read a news article, without the knowing of how that's going to come back to haunt you with your credit rating or things like that, as we've seen Facebook try to patent who your friend groups are, can be a reliable indicator of your credit rating. So I'm not saying that is in any way what you guys are talking about, but there is that potential for misuse and abuse that unfortunately we just don't have the insight into as a consumer and a privacy advocate. And I can see, if I was in your position, because I worked in artificial intelligence for quite a while, and I could have a lot of fun with the data that comes out of my smartphone.
But are people becoming more aware of the privacy purely because it's Snowden?
Yes and no. I mean, ads did form a part of one of the Snowden leaks as a way by which users were tracked, because it goes over the carriers and they can see, again, the metadata. It's not about what you're saying, it's about where you are, what your IP address is, potentially how you're moving, all this kind of intelligence that would be very useful to advertisers, but not the overt kind of in your face, I'm now tracking your purchase. So I think Snowden highlighted it from the government standpoint, but in the privacy community, I think we've always seen the dangers in the Googles, the Facebooks having a monopoly on all this information about us. And Snowden, I think, just did bring it to the forefront of consumers vis-a-vis governments.
What we've understood is that the recent ruling about the safe harbor, right, and it not being applicable anymore, was very, what we've heard certainly is just, it was very linked to actually Snowden.
Absolutely.
They don't necessarily now anymore trust a Facebook to keep your data, right?
Absolutely. And then
from the US government.
Exactly. And if you're an ad company in the UK and you receive a warrant for the metadata on all your subscribers, you've no choice. You have to give it. And that kind of, the ability for then governments to be able to, and I might use the word abuse here because we have seen governments abusing metadata, using it to track down activists and various things like that, which may not have been what the ad agencies were using it for. So seeing the capabilities and the possible inferences that can be made on the basis of your metadata, I think has resonated with a lot of people. And the only way, without knowing the contract, without knowing what fair use is of our data, where it can go on to, I think consumers rightly have only one option, and that is to limit the collection, to stop the information leaving their device, because it's a big bad world out there, and without knowing what onward things can happen, it's just simply the simple solution: just stop the data.
So let me just dive in right there, because there's one thing that's sort of bothering me, and I'd love to hear you talk about this for a second, Roy. So let's assume that all of those assumptions are correct, and that users all of a sudden have the ability to, at the carrier level, block their ads. What alternative remuneration model do you propose for content and content creators? How do people like The Guardian then get paid? Does everyone have to move to a subs model? How does the internet not break with some of these things in place?
Yeah, so I'm not paid to answer that or figure that out for the other side. I'm there to protect the consumers. What I can say is this. I remember the good old...
Sorry, you're not protecting the consumers. You're enabling them to get content for free.
No, I'm protecting them. That's what we do.
So
much as we intended at the get-go to protect them from malware and criminals and such things.
Well, you're like a guy that's found sort of a door in the side of the cinema, and you're like letting people sneak in there for free. And,
not at all.
Because they don't want to buy a ticket.
Not at all. If you think that people are using ad blocking to steal content, then you are completely misunderstanding the situation. This is a story of consumer abuse, period. This is a story of continuation of Snowden. People have drawn a line, and now they can draw that line. Before Shine, before Snowden, there was no line to be drawn because they didn't have the capability.
That's not true.
Please. So to answer your question, though, I remember the good old days when newspapers were very popular. Also in this nation, and then internet happened. It's like, dear God, what's going to happen now? And they figured it out. And then social came about. It's like, dear God, what are we going to do now? They figured it out. And then mobile, dear God, things work out. So if you're resourceful, and if you're talented, and if you're creative, and the gods smile upon you, you're going to be all right. Will there be casualties? Absolutely. But this contract that you speak about does not exist. There was an understanding. And overzealous ad tech executives and companies, and gullible, maybe naive, maybe overzealous publishers as well, took some very bad decisions, which worked out real well for a good amount of time. And people made money, all right, over good content and shitty content. Right, with good technologies and bad technologies. Those days are over. So if you want to have a conversation about whether ad blocking will continue or will disappear, that's not a conversation, it's a fact. Let's be very clear about this. The industry should have a conversation about how do we change the best practices of yesteryear to make sure that we realign ourselves and maybe regain the loyalty of our audience, which apparently we care about.
So it's up to you to sort of decide when the industry has gotten its act together?
No, not at all.
So this is why I sort of have I have
a great idea.
Yeah, Conor.
I feel this is not going to be a good idea for me. But
No, this is a great idea because, at the end of the day, we're talking about consumers, and consumers are accessing content via either a mobile device, over the web, over a fixed line, desktop, you name it, okay? And they're accessing the content. They're accessing my content, they're accessing The Guardian, they're accessing YouTube, they're accessing Channel 4. Now, my current model is advertising. So you block out my advertising. The consumer is still accessing my content. The consumer is paying the network operator. The network operator is paying you. So both of you can pay me, and we do a revenue share. Happy days.
Interesting idea. You should approach your local carrier and have a conversation
Well,
about
no,
that.
I'll approach you. You're right here. So,
I don't,
you know, let's have a conversation about revenue share.
I think it's a valid argument. I think I don't think, in fact, ideas of that sort have come about. Ultimately, though,
copyright
hold on. At the same time, Shine is a technology provider. We do not provide policy, nor do we create the enforcement policy at the carrier level. So
that's fine.
You would have to have that conversation with them. Do I think that,
No,
that
but you're
publishers...
getting paid by the carrier, aren't you?
Yes, we're not philanthropists.
So I can take a share of your revenue.
You can take a share of someone's revenue.
Well,
I'm not sure
why not yours?
Because we've got a good racket going. You're not going to be able to touch our own.
Oh, okay, so you've got a racket going.
Yeah.
Okay. Abuse, right.
To follow on from that, firstly, I'm not sure many of the analogies that I've seen, like a magazine or a TV program or the cinema, necessarily hold true for the internet. I think the internet is essentially a lot more complicated, and the way it works with IP addresses, with routing, with various things like that, the amount of information you surrender, it's not just you going into a cinema, buying a ticket, sitting down, and only the cinema provider or company knows who you are. So there's significantly more complexity underlying all this to surrender various different bits of information. The other thing in relation to this deal is I wouldn't be comfortable knowing that you two guys clubbed together and did that deal in a room somewhere. That to me, as a unless you were incredibly
Would you be okay if I announced it?
Yeah, incredibly transparent about it. As long as I knew that this was a contract. Again, as we discussed the contract, that it's also interesting that you guys are talking about getting my content for free. And previously, many in the industry didn't see data as having value, and now I think there is that realization. And so, having that in the contract, having that as part of the consent process with the user to inform them, hey, look, when you go onto my site, you might also go onto Moads to download whatever content from them, or you might go to whoever to download it from them. They are going to know your IP address. They're going to know what article you were on, yada, yada, yada. If we knew that, but then you get into the kind of the legalese of a 200-page document just to describe when I want to read an RTÉ article. So there probably is a balance, and I think the balance probably comes from fixing some of the underlying problems with the internet around the technology, the leaky technology, that the data that we're talking about that can be used to betray the user is one that is baked in. It's we can't get around it, and that's why some of the analogies break down, because it isn't that one-to-one relationship anymore. It's a one-to-many relationship, and many consumers who want to block this information want to block that one-to-many, but if they knew what that many was, I would surmise with transparency, with information about what would be done with it, and in a legally enforceable way, so that if you transfer my data onto another ad agency, if you guys are sold, many of the email lists are some of the most prized possessions in a mergers and acquisitions field. So to know that information has been transferred on, and potentially to also then say, well, look, maybe I don't want to be part of this anymore. Or is it a case that I've surrendered my data for all time? And so again, these are the kind of the lack of clarity that I think, not just from a consumer perspective, I understand we're in a consumer-oriented environment, but from an individual perspective, simply to understand the ramifications and the implications of just going to a news website would be a very, very good start. But unfortunately, we just don't have that.
Sure,
at the moment.
but if I may, it's not just about protocols and the internet being broken. You know, and the internet was broken to begin with. That's the setup.
I agree.
There's business here, right? And part of the pushback is because the current, and I'm going to use the term, the current racket seems to work out for some sides and less for others. So I'll give you an example. We've run tests around the world, and we've seen that anywhere between 5 to 50% of consumers' data plans are used by ad tech. So imagine you're filling up your gas tank with 10 quid, and then 5 to 50% of that is taken away by someone, right? That subsidizes somebody else's business, right? I don't think that's fair. I believe that's fleecing a consumer. So in fact, do not be surprised if you actually owe your readership some money. Because, for example, and I don't know, I haven't gone to your site and we haven't analyzed it, nor will we. However, somebody did a test on the NewYorkPost.com, their mobile site. And just for a little dinky, mobile page, there was a 37 megabyte payload. Now, do you know this? No, I bet nobody on this panel, and we're fairly okay, we're fairly intelligent, we know how to handle technology. None of us would know that without running some analysis tools. Certainly nobody here and your families. So
you'd like to think
the
that
idea
the
of
design team from the NYT would, because ultimately, if you're going onto a mobile site and it's not loading, the consumer is going to move away.
Actually, they don't. Oftentimes they don't.
They do.
Because it's coming from ad
If
networks.
it doesn't load within 2.5 seconds, they're gone.
So that
Users vote with their eyeballs and their
so
mice.
look, at the end of the day, you can use the bad guys Google if everybody thinks they're bad guys. And you can load in your site and you can see how you compare with the average in terms of your load time. So there are guys that work. We have guys who work on it on a regular basis to make sure that our load time is minimalized, okay? Because I look at competitors and the way they have their structured on their website in terms of high-res images, it takes forever to load. Mm-hmm. Now, those high-res images have got nothing to do with advertising, absolutely nothing, right? They've got to do with the actual site setup. So to make a generalization like that is quite inaccurate. It may well be because of some sites have got bad advertising. And, at the start I said here, there are things we can clean up, and this is a great disruptive moment in terms of basically being able to say, okay, what can we clean up? But to make out these generalizations just doesn't work.
Because these are anecdotes. These are
just two
anecdotes.
things. So first, that specific example was an excellent blog piece that was looking into video fraud. And it's an excellent piece that traces the fraud all the way back. And I agree, there is a ton of brush that needs to get burned out. And I think that a lot of these fraudulent ad calls, and I think a company that could really flourish would be a company that could somehow intelligently block all the bad undergrowth and fraud while letting the actual single valuable ad call that probably is loading politely in the background, et cetera, and following some best practices would work. But what I do want to get at is something a little bit less adversarial, perhaps, and I think you've brought it up a couple times in couple different ways. I, by the way, have no idea how much time we have left, but I'm going to keep going until they pull us out. But the idea of transparency and transactional value, I think, is really interesting because consumers have demonstrated for decades that they are not averse to sharing their data or to being tracked when there's a transparent exchange of value for what they're giving up. So a Nectar card holder or credit card users, they know that their information is being used. You say, okay, for every 1,000 pounds I spend, I get 1,000 happy miles, and I can do this or that and the other thing with them. And I know that you're using that data, or using my Walmart card, or whatever it might be. And users are fine with that. And I think that what it comes down to is that people feel that we are inherently non-transparent, that everything you do goes into this evil, void, black box, and God knows who's doing what with it. And then secondly, there is no clearly understood transactional value for one page on RTE equals this many units. And I'm wondering if those two things somehow come together to create an environment that's very adversarial between advertisers and consumers online.
And without the transparency, as we said earlier, we've seen U.S. health insurers trying to get access to your loyalty cards to find out if you are leading a healthy lifestyle, so that they can engage in things like discriminatory pricing. You might have to pay more for your health insurance and things like that. So again, this comes down to not necessarily the original purpose for why the data was collected, without having the control subsequently over where it goes, what it's used for, and how it may impact me in an area that I didn't really even know. Having that transparency and having full consent for the individual to make that informed choice is a first step, because I think people, if they, as you say, in many cases, they are interested in gaining 10% off their weekly shopping bill, and having that, knowing that it's 10% plus some other risk, informing them about what that other information can be used for, then they would be open to make that decision. But at the moment, it seems like the model of it's ad block is done at the carrier, and everybody signs up to the ad blocker, nobody does, versus the model of the individual decides about what ads they may like to see, or what products or what loyalty cards they sign up for, where they shop. Transparency must be the key first step in order to allow the user.
It's always it's a moving bar though, isn't it? I mean, look, in terms of consumer expectations, you turn on the TV, you expect ads, right? You go to a movie here, you expect ads at the beginning, right? And sometimes you show up late 10 minutes because you want to avoid and block the ads, right? So, you know, when you go to a website, you go to RTE, you should expect ads, right? I think that's not
Everybody's going to be coming to RTE.
but you know,
it's good PR.
And it's fair, but I think it's when you don't know what's happening to your data. And look, we're in the data age, and this is something which is being figured out, and it's a rewriting of the social contract, right? Because that's the age we live in, and you know they say data is the new oil, right? It's being mined and what have you, and so you know there is going to be a rebalancing here of what is expected as a fair exchange of value. It's just what it is.
I think look, there's an element of being upfront, right? There's a lot of things, and you know, you've got good guys and you've got bad guys, because the barrier to entry into the web is so low that you can just create a website and have bots drive it and do all, and we all want to get rid of that, right? But I think there's benchmarks that people set. If you look at what Alan Carr did for the Channel 4 in terms of transparency, the data collection, that's brilliant. It's entertaining, it's clear. And I think people need to do that kind of thing in order to basically say, and is there a value in it? Now, some people might struggle, well, how do I justify my value? Because it's something I haven't done before. I've assumed it. So there's lots of things that you can work on in terms of, stop making assumptions.
But one of the things that I'm often, maybe you guys can shed some light on this, is that me and my wife at home share the same broadband connection. So supposing I'm online and I'm looking for whatever, whether it's porn or, that's the usual classic example, okay? Or some medical, for me, yeah. Or some medical condition or whatever. And all of a sudden, the algorithms have decided that this IP address is now somehow has a medical condition or has a weird fetish for whatever, And then when she goes on, the ads that she's presented with, and all of a sudden what was supposed to be a safe space for me to look at porn and research various different medical conditions, all of a sudden gives her intelligence. I'm not talking about the husband and wife scenario, I'm talking more about flat sharing, various things like that. And this is the kind of level of intelligence that you could glean if all of a sudden you get an ad popped up to see if you a diabetes pill or something along those lines. You could quite easily surmise that the other at least one other person in your household may be suffering from that. And so I'm just curious about how granular the advertising can be, and whether the IP address or various things like that is the only indicator, particularly where you don't have any sign into a website, like you don't sign into RTE and say, hey, I'm Richie Tynan, and my wife doesn't. So the only real thing, and again, this comes back to the notion that not only do we not have the social contract and the transparency, very often there are algorithms sitting behind this that people don't even know. Even the best minds in the world couldn't unpick what the supercomputer is doing in terms of figuring out what your preferences are, and the target case of a woman they knew she was pregnant, and so I'm just genuinely curious about how that can be resolved so that it doesn't, and maybe it can't. Well, but again, this comes back to the potentially more deeper underlying problem of how the internet works, and doing analogies of magazines, newspapers, and getting content for free might break down when I could go into a shop, or I could go somewhere to research stuff on these various medical issues, very privacy and very intimate issues, but that can be used by somebody else in my household, not just, as you say, the evildoers out there, but also somebody else much more closer to home.
Yeah, I'm glad you've raised this. This is one of my pet peeves, because it turns out that the great big supercomputer is quite stupid. There are multitudes of data aggregators, data collectors, third-party data suppliers, and they work on probabilistic mirroring data, and we talked about, there was discussions about deterministic and probabilistic. I got it out. Methodologies in terms of measurement, but it's all crap. by and large, it's all crap. I mean, like, one of the biggest ones that was bought by a giant US company describes me as a 25 to 34-year-old single female who lives in rented accommodation. Now, and I'm also into niche Olympic sports.
Is that true?
When I tell this to people, most people say, do you wax or do you shave? But, I don't know what that's based on, because there's no 25 to 34-year-old females in my house. I'm not single, not yet anyway.
Based on the porn sites you're visiting, clearly.
Well, yeah, maybe. But, if ice skating is a niche Olympic sport, that's my wife, right? Because she's Canadian. But everything else, it's just rubbish. It's just mirroring data. Now, that's because in Ireland, there is no real source of first-party data. So people assume, oh, that's the same behavior as someone out in Bangalore. So that must mean, we'll put that together and we'll do this. So in terms of that data, what's possible, anything is, you can talk better than I can in terms of what's possible. And that's part of the problem, is that people create all this ad tech because they think they can, and it's great, and people should have it, and it has to be done. And, we're going to get VC backing, and everything's going to be great. And, anyone I've shown LumaScape to, they all say, oh, that's just a sign it's going to consolidate. So if you look at it, I think last January, the entire LumaScape was about 1,800 companies. This January, it was about 900 companies. This January, it was 1,800. So it had doubled. And, by mid-June this year, there was 2,500 companies. Now, you'd be doing well if 5% of those companies actually survive. But what are they all doing? They're all just taking data or doing something else or adding something or taking away something. And, so SourcePoint and PageFair, they're going to multiply, as are the ad blockers are going to multiply.
So if I may, just final comment. So this is my favorite part of the conversations I'm always at, where it's like, well, we hate you, ad blocker, Roy. But, those ads, they stink, and they are bad, and they are garbage, and they are abusive.
Some are bad and some are garbage, yes, I would agree.
But this always happens.
Truncating it at the carrier level, though, I think is like the God solution.
You're unhappy with the method, but you agree with the problem. I would be on a beach in Tel Aviv chilling out right now were this problem not to exist and not to be this big. This is a problem. Subscribers, consumers are dissatisfied. Everybody in the industry actually understands this, but it's an inconvenient truth, and the bottom dropped out, and now everybody has to figure out what to do next and how to dig themselves out. So I'm sorry it's inconvenient, but you guys could have spoken out earlier about this, years ago, and didn't. So in a manner of speaking, you should thank us that we're here to help you evolve to where you guys probably should be, which is not garbage and not the LumaScapes and all these sorts of things.
But you are part of the LumaScape.
I'm sorry?
You are part of the LumaScape, so.
I hope not. That would bum me out.
What is LumaScape?
LumaScape is this horror of a snapshot of what the ad tech industry looks like. Yeah, you should look no further than LumaScape to understand how fraudulent this industry is.
So that pretty much wraps up our time. I'm getting signals from off stage. Thank you all very much, and thanks to the panel. Have a great rest of the day.
Good to meet you. Pleasure.